Hello, 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 everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar, and I'm here to answer your questions about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, or any of the other stories, or just questions about Tolkien himself. If you enjoy the video, if you enjoy the content, please hit a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and just leave me a comment as well. I like comments. And of course, if you have a question that you wish answered, I will answer any questions you give me in comments, of course. But if you want it to be featured in a video, the best way to do this is through Quora. If you look at the description on the video, you can see a link to my Quora account, and there you can tag me in any question you ask in there, and you'll also get other people answering you too. Anyway, each week, of course, I choose my favorite questions to feature in videos, and I think I have 16. I have 16 this time. So let's start with a question asked by Samuel Ortiz. Did Balrogs and dragons have a name before being a mockery, as evil cannot create? It should be mentioned that Balrogs were not created by evil. They were created by Iluvatar, that's God. They betrayed him and joined Melkor. They are, in essence, fallen angels, just like Sauron. As for dragons, the exact nature and origin of them is not known, other than that they were created by Melkor. Of course, created can be kind of a loose term. Melkor is a Vala, and that means that he was certainly capable of creation. He was part of the Ainur Lindale, like all of the other Ainur, and he created the entire concept of evil and the entire concept of discord. He's not without this power. Tolkien never stated that evil cannot create, but that evil cannot create anything new. Dragons, as evil creations, were likely created through an already existing being that was corrupted and twisted into what they are. It could have just been lizards. It could have been dinosaurs. Melkor could have captured them, empowered them, corrupted them. The process of doing this, of course, we don't know, but we can surmise that it could have been something that both Melkor and Sauron have been known to do, which is necromancy, or Morgul magic. So it seems likely that to give sentience of a sort to the creatures that would become dragons, or the creatures that would become trolls, or vampires, or werewolves, they were imbued with captured souls of their enemies. Melkor could not create something new, and he could not create any sort of life that had free will. That was another big caveat. That was the difference between Iluvatar and the Ainur. Aule, for example, created the dwarves, and they did not have free will initially. They were basically Aule's puppets until they were given free will by Iluvatar through the power of the secret fire. Now, this is why creatures like dragons are always evil. They don't really have their own will. The first dragon, Glaurung, all the way down to Smaug, they were all Melkor's creations. It also should be mentioned, since I spoke about the secret fire, is that in that time that the children of Iluvatar were created and that Ea and Arda were created, the secret fire was within God. It was within Iluvatar. But when he created Ea, the physical manifestation of the music of the Ainur, and he created the world Arda, the kingdom of Arda, the planet, he actually placed the secret fire within the planet. So things do work a little bit differently going there forward, but it should be mentioned that it's not that evil can never create, because they can create a lot of things. Evil can create all sorts of things. They can create clever things, they can create wicked things, they can create tricky things, but they can't create beautiful things, they can't create new and wondrous things, and they can't create life that has free will. Even the good Valar cannot create life that has free will. So anyway, Good question, though. Okay, next question. Why did the movie Boromir feel the need to explain the landscape of the realm of Mordor in detail in front of people who had vastly more knowledge and experience with the Dark Kingdom and Sauron than him? So, part of this is just that it's actually exposition. Boromir seems like he's explaining it to the characters that are there, but he's really explaining it to the audience. Peter Jackson repeats this trick a little bit later on in the same film, where Gimli explains the area around Mordor to Aragorn. Of course, Aragorn already knows this, but Gimli's really speaking to the audience. Now, this isn't to say that it's a bad idea for Boromir to do this, because it's 100% in character. It makes perfect sense for Boromir to speak in this fashion. He has been on the front lines as a man of Gondor, fighting against Mordor for his entire adult life. And from his point of view, all these elves and wizards and half-elves, they're all a bunch of stuffy intellectuals who have little to no actual involvement in the conflict. They're not out there on the front lines. They've never been to Mordor. I mean, we know that Elrond has been to Mordor, but I'm talking about from Boromir's perspective. That was thousands of years ago in the Second Age. What does he know about the way things are now? So, from Boromir's perspective, and you can kind of sympathize with it a little bit, from what he's being told, not only would the One Ring not be used against Sauron or even kept safe away from him, but they were basically going to deliver it to him. They were going to bring it into Sauron's domain, and this seemed to be foolish to Boromir. And not only did it seem to be foolish, but it also seemed to be something impossible and incredibly dangerous. So, yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense for him to talk to them that way until you think about who he is as a character, and also just understand that that's the way that storytelling works, that we have exposition where he's really explaining it to the audience more than he's explaining it to, say, Elrond or Gandalf. Okay, next question. This one was asked by Mallow Mustaine. Do Maiar and Valar need to sleep or eat? What do they do in their free time? Generally speaking, none of the Ainur would ever need to eat or to sleep. It is mentioned that some of them do slumber. It's a choice that they make. They don't have to sleep. They're discarnate spirits, the Ainur, and that includes the Valar and the Maiar. They're not merely immortal, they're eternal, and thus they do not experience hunger, thirst, pain, weariness, or aging. Now, this is the reason, by the way, just as an aside, I always say that Ungoliant is not one of the Ainur. She is a spirit, perhaps a primordial spirit of some sort, but not an Ainu. And the reason I say that is because Ungoliant was motivated by food, to consume light. She was always hungry. And the Ainur do not get hungry. Now, there are incarnate spirits who are in a way shackled to real bodies. This would be the Istari, the wizards. They do experience hunger, thirst, pain, weariness, aging, all of those things. That's why Gandalf needs food. Gandalf needs to sleep. But as for what they do in their downtime, I suppose it depends on their function. Even each Ainur has their own function, and if they're not doing that function, they're probably just doing whatever they wish to do for leisure. But generally speaking, they sort of all love their work. Like, Aule loves crafting things because that's what was put into him, the love of doing that. So he probably spends pretty much all his time crafting things. Hey, interesting question. Okay, now this is one that I like. I like this question. It came anonymously, but this person asked, who is the most incompetent character in The Lord of the Rings? And I have to say, the name that jumps out to me right away to hand this inglorious title over to is Saruman. Saruman was just bad at his job from the get-go because he had a poor attitude. Instead of being the leader that he was meant to be, he was more interested in artifacts and weapons than he was with people. He had disdain for men and hobbits and dwarves. He only really cared for the elves, and he didn't really understand why the elves did not adore him the way that they adored Gandalf. He also had disdain for the other wizards. Of course, I mentioned Gandalf, but he also had a lot of disdain for Radagast. He saw Radagast as a fool, and the only thing that he could learn from this guy was how to speak to birds, and nothing else that Radagast would have to say, or nothing else that he had to teach was worth it for Saruman, from his perspective at least. As the leader of the White Council, he had a poor attitude. He assumed that all of the other members of the council were just like him, and that they were all secretly working towards their own agendas. And this is a very combative way to approach these sort of meetings. It doesn't foster a lot of cooperation or sharing of ideas, and I can't stress how much harm this caused in the long run. He was careless in his use of the Palantir. It allowed Sauron to see into his mind instantly, and his poor attempts at deceiving the Dark Lord were never going to work. As a villain, he also was incompetent. He refused to actually fight, as Gandalf did. Instead, he put out an army that was poorly trained, poorly armed, just hoping to overwhelm by strength of numbers, and of course it didn't work. Saruman could have done so much more if he had actively taken part in these battles. One of the strangest choices was in the Two Towers, when he was disguised and he came across Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas. They did not know who he was. They just saw an old man, and they welcomed him to come and sit by the fire and speak with them. And he had this amazing opportunity where he could have done so. He could have fooled them. He could have pretended to be anybody, just some random old man in Rohan. He could have learned about the One Ring. He could have learned about what they were up to. But instead, all he did was scare their horses off and then flee. So, yeah, he's just not good at... He's not good at being the chief good guy. He's not good at being a bad guy. He was a poor wizard. He was a poor villain. And that's how he ends the way he does. He's reduced to being a beggar and a gangster trying to take over the Shire. You know, it's... And just for petty revenge, not for any grandiose scheme, just because the hobbits aggravated him and he wished to cause them to be aggravated instead. So yeah, as soon as you asked who was the most incompetent character, immediately I just thought Saruman. Okay. Alright, next question. This one's anonymous. At the Council of Elrond, Boromir said of the ring, "It is a gift." Okay, so this is the movie. Was this a nod to the fact that the ring was made by Annatar? Because Annatar was Sauron, but Annatar literally means Anna is gift, Tar is lord or king, so lord of gifts. It should be mentioned that it is a gift line that Boromir said was actually in the book, but not at the Council of Elrond. It was far later. He made his speech at the spot where he would very soon die, actually, at Amon Hen. And he ranted and raved, trying to convince Frodo to bring the One Ring to Gondor. I'm going to read you that passage from the Fellowship of the Ring. Boromir got up and walked about impatiently. "So you go on," he cried. "Gandalf, Elrond, all these folk have taught you to say so. For themselves they may be right. These elves and half-elves and wizards, they would come to grief, perhaps. Yet often I doubt if they are wise and not merely timid, but each to his own kind. True-hearted men, they will not be corrupted. We of Minas Tirith have been staunch through long years of trial. We do not desire the power of wizard lords, only strength to defend ourselves, strength in a just cause. And behold, in our need chance brings to light the Ring of Power. It is a gift, I say, a gift to the foes of Mordor. It is mad not to use it, to use the power of the enemy against him. The fearless, the ruthless, these alone will achieve victory. What could not a warrior do in this hour, a great leader? What could not Aragorn do? Or if he refuses, why not Boromir? The ring would give me the power of command. How I would drive the hosts of Mordor, and all men would flock to my banner. And he goes on for a while, by the way. But there's the "it is a gift" part from the book. Boromir was largely ignorant of the nature of the One Ring, and he did not likely know the story of Annatar, who came bearing gifts of knowledge. He was deluded by visions that the One was sending him. And he was the spiritual link, the spiritual weak link in the Fellowship. That's why the ring targeted him. If it was an Annatar reference, it really wouldn't make sense anyway, I have to say, because Sauron did not give the One Ring as a gift. It was the knowledge to create rings of power that he would later control with the One Ring. So it wasn't really a reference to Annatar. It was just a reference to a speech that Boromir made in the book. He just made it at a different time. Okay. Next question. This is from the Oski Boski. If Sauron knew how he would end up after the deeds he had done against Arda, would he give up doing evil and remain Mairon? No, I don't think he could help himself. To be honest with you, I think that he was always going to be evil at one point or another. Sauron definitely had some fear of what might happen to him. At one point, he tried to surrender himself to Ainur for pardon after the War of Wrath. And he was told that he needed to go speak to Manwë about that. Ainur did not have the authority to pardon him. And Sauron was not about that life at all. Sauron tried to curry favor with the Valar by doing good deeds. But he was either too afraid or too proud to actually bring himself to travel to Valinor and supplicate himself in that fashion. And let's be honest, it was both. He was both afraid and proud. He couldn't even keep up the whole "I'm going to do good works in Middle-earth and heal the land" bit for very long. Eventually, he thought, the Valar have abandoned Middle-earth, and it's up to me to bring about order, and that was just how he slipped right back into evil. I think the way that Sauron's mind works is he's always going to see disorder. He's always going to see a way that everything should be tightly controlled. He's always going to be frustrated with any sort of chaotic nature, and I think that that's always going to lead him to want to be in control. And that's sort of similar to Melkor. He wanted to be in control. He wanted to be God. He wanted to be the guy that was in charge of everything. And it led to him eventually just wanting to destroy everything because he couldn't be that. Sauron was only less evil than Melkor in the way that Sauron was not the Dark Lord initially. He was a follower. So, yeah. Okay, next question. This one is also from the Oski Boski, who asks, if Morgoth stole one of the Palantir with him while he was banished in the Void, could he speak through it to Sauron through the Void in Middle-earth? It's a cool idea, but I'm gonna say no. In the book Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth, in the chapter The Palantiri, which I think is actually the last chapter in the book before the index, Tolkien mentioned that the Palantir were attuned to look in specific directions, and they needed to be aligned properly by being set down just so, on their axis. That's why they were usually found in basins, where they could be rotated but stay on the axis. You could look this way, you could look that way, because you always had to look in a specific direction through the ball, but you could turn it as long as it was resting on its axis. That's the way that Tolkien described the way that they work. And he also mentioned that it was an incredible coincidence. It was through sheer luck that when Pippin grabbed the Palantir from Gandalf and set it down, that he just so happened to place it on its axis, so it was properly attuned and aligned, and that's how he came into contact with Sauron. One might say that Pippin was actually unlucky that this happened, but it turned out for the best, of course. So the Orthancs don't just happen to be plopped down in its axis in that scene, but generally speaking, you need to set it on something. So if Morgoth is in the void, which is essentially space, if he had the ball, he wouldn't have a way to set it down properly. So he wouldn't be able to do that. So it's an interesting idea, though. If not for that story about the Palantir, you could imagine him maybe holding it in his hand or something and talking to Sauron and giving him ideas. It would be a cool sort of like fan idea. It's just, like I said, Tolkien did explain in pretty big detail, I would say, exactly how those seeing stones worked. All right, this next question was asked by Christopher Pullman. And he asks, upon seeing the splendor of Taniquetil, our Pharazon's fear bests his pride. He orders the great armament to retreat, having anchored it. But never actually setting foot on the shores of Valinor, how might the Valar react? What might Sauron now do? So, yeah, what Christopher is asking here, so Pharazon was the last king of Numenor, and he went to Valinor. Him and an armada actually got there, they anchored, they stepped foot on Valinor, and then the Akalabeth happened. And it's mentioned that after coming around the Isle of Eressëa, which is an island off the coast of Aemon, the great mountain of Taniquetil came into view in its majesty and splendor, and Pharazon started to have second thoughts. But his fear was overcome by his pride. Now, there's also another issue. The fallacy of sunk costs. He already had come so far, and I think that in itself would make it very difficult for him to actually turn back. But let's say he did. Let's follow Christopher's very interesting hypothetical here. Let's say his fear overcame his pride instead of his pride overcoming his fear. And it's actually one of my favorite hypotheticals to think, what if Pharazon finally rounds the Isle of Eressëa, Taniquetil comes into view, filled with awe and majesty, and the king looks to the shore, and he sees before him Eanwe, herald of Manwe, standing there silently with only a gesture to communicate, silently pointing towards the east, towards Numenor. Pharazon turns right around, he never steps foot on Aemon, and he leaves. What happens next? That's the question, right? It is possible that the Akalabeth might have just still happened. Even with successfully preventing the invasion, Numenor had still set out for Aemon and made it just about there with evil intent. Sauron was behind all this, but let's say, for the sake of the hypothetical, that the Akalabeth doesn't happen. What does happen? So here's my thought. Here's my sort of spur-of-the-moment fan fiction, right? So I think Numenor is going to face some form of reclamation from the Valar. They don't need to get a Iluvatar involved, but they are capable of handling this. And I think that it's justly deserved. It's not just for the attempted invasion, but for alienating the elves of Eressëa, the Black Numenorians oppressing men in Middle-earth and having slaves, their pride, their worship of Melkor, their acceptance of Sauron. It's all bad. I believe one of the Valar, and I'm going to choose that it's Ulmo, because this makes the most sense to me. Ulmo is going to show up in his majesty and dread and demand a simple ultimatum. Either turn over Sauron and agree to dismantle the Melkor cult and make amends in Middle-earth, or Ossë gets to have all the fun he wants. So in the end, I think it ends with Numenor being destroyed no matter what. Tolkien once wrote that the men of Numenor yearned for a Akalabeth. And you can kind of see that when you really stack up their misdeeds the way I have. And I think in this case, the destruction would have come by their own hands than from Iluvatar, but I still think that eventually the kingdom is going to fall. Fun question. Okay, next question is from, what is this username? Heyhashubufus? Some person. Okay. They asked, Why is Christmas mentioned in The Hobbit when they are chased up trees by wolves? To put it simply, the reason that Christmas is mentioned is the same reason that in some versions of The Hobbit, China is mentioned. At the start, The Hobbit was a standalone fairy story that was not connected to any greater works. The bones of Tolkien's legendarium do predate The Hobbit. There was The Children of Húrin, for example, is an older story than The Hobbit. The Hobbit started as nothing more glorious than a bedtime story that was told by the author to his son Christopher. And Christopher's keen attention to detail and, his continuity, his obsession with continuity, forced his father to start writing down ideas, because he would be telling the story and then little Christopher, last time you told me Bilbo's door was green and now you're saying it's blue, so which is it? And Tolkien comes out of the room, confound the boy, and he starts writing everything down. That's how it happened. That's literally how it happened. So that's how it went from being an oral tale to a written tale, but it was essentially a fairy story written for his children. It wasn't connected to the Silmarillion. It wasn't connected to any of the Silmarillion's satellite stories. So there was no need for the author to worry about having continuity with other stories or having to worry about this is in the past, long before Christmas, right? He wasn't thinking of that. So if you understand that it's a children's story and that it's not connected to anything in its inception, describing the type of tree that Philly and Killy were holed up in as a Christmas tree is a good way for a young boy or a young girl reading the book to immediately have a visual in their head. Every kid knows what a Christmas tree looks like. So they immediately know what kind of tree, and it helps them sort of paint the portrait in their mind. Now, The Hobbit did get revised a few times, and it helped with some issues when The Lord of the Rings was written, and there needed to be continuity with The Lord of the Rings because The Lord of the Rings was a sequel. But The Lord of the Rings wound up, in its inception, not being connected to anything but The Hobbit, but eventually it was connected to the Silmarillion, which means it was connected to Beren and Luthien, it was connected to the Children of Húrin, it was connected to everything. And that retroactively made The Hobbit also connected to all those things. So it seems really strange that Christmas trees would be mentioned. Why would Bilbo write that? It was mentioned in The Lord of the Rings that there was a winter holiday in the Shire. It was Yule. So it could be that if we're going by the in-universe explanation that Bilbo wrote Yule in Westron, and then Tolkien translating it to Christmas initially in English, and then later came to understand that it was not, and in The Lord of the Rings referred to it as Yule. So that's the sort of in-universe explanation as far as there is any. Okay, next question. This one's anonymous. Did the Balrog ever speak in Tolkien's mind? Tolkien never mentioned Balrog speaking. Not even in the earliest versions of the Legendarium, when they were a lot less powerful and there were a lot of Balrogs out there. There's reason to believe that Tolkien wanted it to be understood that Balrogs never spoke. During the 50s, there was an animated version of The Lord of the Rings that was, well, I can't say that it was being produced. It was sort of in pre-production. It never got very far. There was a treatment, not even a script, but a treatment that was sent to Tolkien, and he did not approve of it. Tolkien's policy was art or money. In other words, either get it right, art, or pay me a lot to overlook all the terrible things you've done to my work. So, in this case, they got it really wrong, apparently. And Tolkien noted in the treatment that if it seemed as if the author of the outline for the film had only read The Lord of the Rings once a long time ago, very quickly, and then they were forming the film's ideas from half-forgotten memories. Anyway, the reason I bring up this failed production is that Tolkien had a lot of notes on it, and one of the many, many, many notes that Tolkien wrote about this was the Balrog should not make any vocal sound, and certainly not laugh or sneer. This, to me, is an indication that in Tolkien's mind that Balrogs were either fully mute, or if they had the ability to speak or to make vocal noises, they just chose not to. So, I guess that's the answer right there. Okay, next question is from Gabriel Gandalf, who asks, why is Bard called Bard in The Hobbit? His name has nothing to do with his character. Am I missing something? So, yeah, obviously when you hear Bard, you might have a certain thought in your mind of a troubadour or a spy or a poet or something like that. It's likely that in-universe Bard's name is Dalish, which is a language that has not been really all that fleshed out in Tolkien's work. It's not really glossed, so we don't know the meaning of Bard in that sense. Whatever Dalish meaning lies behind Bard's name, we don't know, but as for why Tolkien called him Bard, it's very possible that he derived the word from the Germanic Bard, which means beard, or perhaps the Celtic Bard, which means guardian. Either way, the names of the men of Rhovanion did not need to be specific descriptors of them as people. They did not derive from Numenor, and they didn't follow the tradition of using elvish naming conventions in describing themselves like that. That wasn't ingrained in their culture. Okay, I need to drink a little water here. I have a heartburn problem, and I got like a very severe heartburn problem. I actually medicate for it, and not till the morning, but sure, a little water helps there. All right, next question, and this was from Martin Stallard, and he asks, in The Lord of the Rings, what are the fates of the 19 lesser rings? The Rings of Power, not the lesser rings, by the way, but the 19 rings were the Rings of Power. They all lost their power after the destruction of the One Ring, so at this point, they're just jewelry. The 3 seemed to be kept by their keepers, and they were all taken west. It is specifically mentioned at the end of The Lord of the Rings that Frodo noticed Galadriel's ring and Gandalf's ring at the Grey Havens, and Elrond's ring was also mentioned, as this was the scene where the 3 of them passed from Middle-earth into the west. So those 3 rings went with them to Valinor. The 7 rings were already partly destroyed. 4 of them were destroyed by dragons. The word that Tolkien used was consumed, and this could mean literally eaten or could mean consumed by flames, but either way, they're gone. So out of those 4 were destroyed. That leaves 3 of those, and they were recaptured by Sauron. Sauron had them in his keeping, and he also had the 9 in his keeping. So there were 12 rings that survived, other than the 3 that passed west, and they were in Sauron's keeping, which means that they likely were in Barad-dûr when it collapsed. And if that did not destroy them, then they're just lying there under the wreckage without any power or importance. Okay. Next question is from Gabriel Gandalf again, who asks, why does Gandalf advise Frodo not to use the ring again in his letter to him? What was the moment when Gandalf learned that Frodo had already used the ring? It's not known if Gandalf really knew of Frodo specifically having used the ring at this point. When they last met, Frodo hadn't really used it. When Gandalf spoke to Frodo initially about the ring, Frodo mentioned it might come in handy. Gandalf said, I'm not so sure about that, advised him not to use it, but to keep it safely stowed away somewhere. 17 years later, when he came to test the ring, it was clear that Frodo had done as Gandalf asked. He had it lying in a drawer. We don't hear about Frodo actually having worn the ring until after his journey starts, which is after Gandalf wrote the letter. He had left the letter with Barlaman, and Barlaman had actually forgotten to send it. So Gandalf's usage of the word again is curious. It does mean that Gandalf has made perhaps an assumption that Frodo must have used it at some point, and I think this does make some sense. While Frodo managed to not wear the ring or even carry it with him prior to this, when Frodo asserted that he wished to destroy the ring, Gandalf tested him. He said, okay, cast it into the fire right now. And Frodo couldn't do it. Even knowing that the fire would not only not harm the ring, but wouldn't even warm it up. The ring had Frodo. And Gandalf most likely made an educated guess at this point that since he had last seen Frodo, it had been about 9 years since he had last visited at this point, Frodo probably had worn the ring at some point. Okay. Next question. This is from Avery Goodman. Avery asks, did Saruman tell Sauron that he'd imprison Gandalf? I don't think so. It's possible, but I don't think that Saruman would have done that. It's important to note that though Saruman seemed to be a de facto ally of Sauron's, he was really working for himself. And Sauron knew this. This is why, after being defeated by Rohan, Saruman was really in a bad position. He had enemies on all sides. Saruman's capture of Gandalf was never meant to be permanent. Saruman was under the delusion that Gandalf was going to join him. He was going to come around. He was going to be convinced, and that together they could reclaim the One, overthrow Sauron, and run Middle-earth. He did not even deprive Gandalf of his staff when he detained him. And he was quite surprised when he checked a few days later to find that Gandalf had disappeared. So that being said, Saruman was duplicitous with everyone, including Sauron, and I doubt he would have informed Sauron of his captive. Okay, next question. This one's from, let's see if I say this right, Faranef? I hope I'm saying that right. Did Frodo break his mind when Gollum took the ring by force? Frodo's mind was already pretty broken at that point, but losing the ring in that fashion definitely messed him up. It deprived him of healing. At this point, Frodo has been pushed beyond his limits, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, by the journey, by the burden of the One Ring. Frodo finally succumbs to the seduction of the One Ring. He couldn't destroy it. As I mentioned, he couldn't even throw it into the fire in his house, knowing that couldn't possibly even harm it. He couldn't do that. So was he really ever going to be able to throw it into Sammath Naur? There's no way, right? If Frodo had miraculously succeeded, he would have recovered. Eventually. But having the One taken from him in such a fashion was damaging. It was as damaging of a loss to him as it was to Gollum. Now, thankfully, Frodo's not a foul wretch like Gollum was, and he had good friends to help him out, though even the gem that Arwen gave him could not fully help him cope with the loss, and this is one of the many reasons that he had to sail west. And final question. This one's from Marshall Wood, and Marshall asks, where would Melkor stand in the pecking order of the Valar if he had not rebelled? It's interesting, because it's easy to sort of assume that due to Melkor rebelling, falling, Manwë sort of replaced him in the function that Ilúvatar had thought for him. But I actually don't think that's the case. Melkor was the mightiest, and he was the greatest of the Valar, but he was not the most beloved by Ilúvatar. Manwë always was the most beloved. And it's my thought that Ilúvatar always intended for Manwë and Varda to be the king and queen of Arda. So what was Melkor's function going to be? Melkor was given the greatest gifts of power and wisdom, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. He had the same powers, abilities, knowledge that all of the other Valar and all of the Maiar had. And it was also immediately and chiefly in his interest, in his heart, to create. And that's why he sought out the flame imperishable, the secret fire in the void, before even the Ainur Lindale happened, not realizing that it was within Iluvatar, because he wished to shape the void in his own image. He wished for it to be filled with things that were of his own thought. After the Ainur Lindale, the war of music that they all waged against Melkor, Iluvatar proclaimed the Ainur mighty, and Melkor was the mightiest among them. He did not reproach Melkor for creating the concepts of evil and discord with his song, or for fighting for control of the music, but simply commented that he was the mightiest. Then Iluvatar revealed his grand design, the creation of Ea, the universe, and Arda, the world, the music of the Ainur given form. I'm going to read a relevant passage from the Silmarillion for you. But when they were come into the void, Iluvatar said to them, "Behold your music." And he showed to them a vision, giving to them sight where before was only hearing. And they saw a new world made visible before them, and it was globed amid the void, and it was sustained therein, but was not of it. And as they looked and wondered, this world began to unfold its history, and it seemed to them that it lived and grew. And when the Ainur had gazed for a while and were silent, Iluvatar said again, "Behold your music. This is your minstrelsy, and each of you will find contained herein, amid the design that I set before you, all these things which it may seem that he himself devised or added. And thou, Melkor, wilt discover all the secret thoughts of thy mind, and wilt perceive that they are but a part of the whole, and tributary to its glory." In the music given form, Melkor's thoughts are a part of that. Not just a part of his thoughts, but all of his thoughts, all the secret thoughts of Melkor's mind are in there. And Iluvatar states that they are a part of creation. You might even say an essential part. Melkor had free will, but he was not forced to become the foe of Iluvatar, or he wasn't forced to become the foe of the Valar. But I believe that Iluvatar knew from the beginning, from before he even created Melkor, how everything was going to end. Iluvatar exists beyond time and beyond space. He can see everything. Everything that was, everything that is, and everything that will be. So I think that from the outset, he knew that Melkor would be his foe, and the foe of the Ainur, and that Melkor's evil and discord was essential to creation. I'm going to read another passage from the Silmarillion. "And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." Melkor's power is Iluvatar's power. His will is Iluvatar's will. He just doesn't know it. So I can't say that in the mind of Iluvatar that there was any other function for Melkor other than the function that he took up for himself. So that was the final question. Some very, very good questions. I really enjoyed answering these. So I'll see you guys next time. And of course, we also have the last part of the Middle-earth iceberg going up, and also I have something else that I'm working on having to do with casting some films. So I'll see you guys next time. Leave me some comments.